Why do we need old books? Why do we read old books? How do you translate and update classic works for a modern audience? Welcome to the Virtual Jewel Box, podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. I'm Scott Black, Director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and today I am delighted to be joined by Daniel Mendelsohn to discuss his new translation of the Odyssey with Jordan Jonansen, Assistant Professor of Classics at the University of Utah. Through his many essays, books, and now his wonderful new translation, Dr. Mendelsohn is one of our best contemporary guides to Homer's Odyssey. His own translation is notable for being both faithful to the original and a wonderful English poem in its own right, which recreates Homer's Greek poetry in our own language, and so enables Homer's great classic to continue to speak to us.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I thought the event last night was so interesting, so
good.
great.
Thank you.
I'd heard you talk. I did my PhD at the University of Chicago, so I heard you talk. Was that last 2 years ago when you came?
Oh, in Chicago. Yeah. That was fun.
So it's been a few years. I got to follow this translation, and I was really excited that you were coming. And
great.
My students were really excited that you're coming as well.
Excellent.
So that's one of the things I wanted to start with. So we had the Homerathon on Monday and Wednesday. Right. And this was really directed by the students. And we read your translation. The students wanted to read your translation since you're coming.
Right.
And we spent 15 hours, sometimes out in the rain, reading.
No way.
Yeah. And we had about 150 people come by, read, really exciting. And we read aloud for hours, right? Mm-hmm. And it was such a different experience. I've listened to your audiobook. I've read the translation, but actually sitting in community with students and faculty, staff, but physically reading it aloud was such a different experience for me. I could really hear the poetry and feel the poetry in my mouth. So I wanted to ask you, like, how, when you were thinking about this translation, but also when you were actually doing the translation, how reading aloud, the physical experience of the sounds and the orality, how that affected the way that you translated.
Oh, very much so. I was very conscious of wanting to create a translation that had a degree of musicality, because meter is what sets verse apart from prose. And when one reads Homer in Greek, one is very aware of the meter in a way that I don't think one is necessarily aware of the meter in a lot of English translations, particularly translations that use blank verse or iambic pentameter. Mm-hmm. And because one of my priorities was to try to find a way to recreate the line, I really did think a lot about crafting each line in a way that sort of forced you to feel the rhythms and the music. And so my typical process actually was each day I would do about 30 lines. That was a day's work. And first I sort of did a rough draft for sense, and then I did a lot of research and made sure that I was getting everything. And then I had to fit it into this metrical form that I was interested. And then I read it aloud to myself, because quite often the way that you experience something as you read silently is quite different from the way that it sounds when you actually speak it. So quite often a line would look okay on the page. I thought, oh, okay, I've done that, and it's got the right meter. And then when I read it aloud, I would realize that the rhythms of natural English speech were not quite working out. So I thought a lot about that. And I'm very happy to hear that it seemed to have worked.
I think it worked like brilliantly. And when I was reading aloud, you could really feel like the alliterations and even just honestly, the enjambment was what I was so impressed with. It's one of my favorite parts about Homer is the enjambment. And there were times where I was like, I'm reading this wrong because there's an enjambment, but I was like, that's how it's supposed to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I try to recreate the enjambment whenever possible. Obviously, English and Greek have different syntaxes and you can't always do it. But whenever I felt that Homer enjambs in a very pointed way, I would tie myself in knots trying to think of a way to get the English to do what he's doing, because I think it's very important. Now, a lot of people don't pay attention to that, but I think it's one of the most important tools in Homer's toolkit.
Yeah, I mean, your translation for me is one that I would want students who are Greek students to read, because I think it gets across a lot of the aspects that I love in the Greek, which is the sound, the alliterations, the actual physical sounds, but also these enjambments and the different meanings, which I think is often missing in other translations. And it does follow the Greek. The fidelity is there, which I think go to your translation to say, like, if you want to understand how deep the Greek is, this is something that can help you on your process of learning.
Thank you.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm really interested, so this is my second year at the University of Utah. I am trained as an ancient historian and a classicist, but I never thought I would be teaching so much Homer and I'm a real generalist here, which has been really fun. And this is my first year teaching Homer. So I've taught a little bit of Homer here and there in like Greek civilization classes. But this year I got to teach in the Great Books course, and I'm also teaching classical mythology, and we're reading Homer in there. And so I was really interested, and I loved your memoir. I read that a few years ago. And I think I didn't have a typical classics background. Never took that undergraduate freshman seminar in the Odyssey. And I jumped in graduate school going, I need to learn the philology and the meter and the weird dialect here. And so it was also, your memoir was like taking a class of how to teach Homer. And so I was wondering how teaching the poem has shaped the way you translated it, but also how the process of translating has changed the way you teach Homer now.
I think that the greatest intimacy that one can have with a text is as a translator. I mean, even I've taught this poem many times over the last 3.5 decades, but I think when you have to translate something, you have to get into the bones in a totally different way. And the sort of discoveries that I made, I've been thinking about this thing for a long time, but even so, there were things that popped out at me that I hadn't really noticed before. For example, Eumaeus, the swineherd. I noticed that he's very sarcastic. He has a very sarcastic turn of phrase, which I hadn't really ever paid attention to. But when you're reading the original text because you're writing a scholarly article or, you're working on something, you're reading it in ultimately a sort of passive way. But when you're translating it and you have to actually have a sense of what these characters are putting across, you experience it in a very different way. And so I noticed a lot about the characters, I would say, that I hadn't really sampled before. And that I thought was a really interesting, because you've got to give them a voice.
Yeah.
And that means you're acting a little bit, so to speak, through the translation. And so that forces you to really wrestle with what's going on in the text in a different way than if you're just teaching it being a critic.
Yeah, I think that comes through. Eumaeus is, I thought, really different than I had experienced him before. There was a lot of funny moments I found as well. And I really loved every time you had the no one, the italicized no one. And I was just like, it made it just a joy to read, because it is funny. It is all of these things. It's complicated. And I think that really comes out in your translation.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So I had in 8th grade, we read Huckleberry Finn, and my 8th grade teacher said that you should revisit Huckleberry Finn every 10 years because while the book won't change, you will change, and the experience of reading it will change. And so I have done that. I've reread it. I'm probably about to reread it again. And you've taught the Odyssey for decades, and I think the Odyssey is the same kind of book where you reread it, and every time you reread it, it is something new. And you write in your memoir about reading it and teaching it to your father, reading it with your father. And I think the poem, it can really reveal different things depending on your stage of life. So I was wondering how that experience has been with you, reading it as a young person and reading it throughout different stages of your life, and how that has changed.
Of course it changes. I think that any really great text is always going to offer you different things at different times in your life, because your own equipment keeps morphing. And the Odyssey, I think, one at the beginning, you're sort of paying a lot of attention to the adventure stuff, which is so appealing for young people. And then, certainly when I taught that seminar that my father visited, and I was then in my early 50s, I was suddenly paying a lot of attention to the father-son stuff and the parent-children thing. Penelope and Telemachus, Telemachus and Odysseus, Odysseus and Laertes, and that had never really occurred to me before. And now that I'm in my 60s, I'm suddenly noticing all this stuff about time. I think the Odyssey is very preoccupied with time and what it does to our understanding of who we are and our ability to talk about what has happened to us. I just think, yeah, any great book is going to do that. I think everything should be reread every 10 years, basically. Anything that has real depth, because you're a moving target.
Right.
And of course, that's what the Odyssey is about.
Right.
You're not the same person as time goes by. In some ways, yes, but in other ways, no. And so the you of high school is hopefully not the you of the age of 55 or 65. And so that new you needs to re-experience it. And you will keep seeing different things depending on where you are in your own journey.
Yeah, thank you for that. And last night you talked about Calypso saying, why would you go back to Penelope? She's aging. She's just going to get older and uglier. Why would you go back? I'm a goddess. And Odysseus still chooses to go back to his aging wife. And I've read this passage many times, but I hadn't really thought about what that might mean as one ages, to have heroes, and there's desire still in aging. And I think what you said about the Iliad of being the youth that's cut short, and you don't get an old Achilles. That's
you can't even
the
imagine
whole point,
an old
right?
Achilles.
Exactly. And to have a hero that ages and then grows in that age and changes, I think is such an interesting way to approach Odyssey. Also an important text then to teach to young people, right?
Totally.
Yeah, that it's not just about right now, right? There's things that
that will await you.
Yes,
you can read it now with great pleasure, but just think how much fun it will be to read it when you're 35 and then 55, and absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm interested. You lived with this translation in the Odyssey. You've lived for a long time with the Odyssey, but now you've lived deep in with the Odyssey. You said 6.5 years wrestling with it. And you had talked about the polytropos at the very beginning, and how it wasn't until a week before the kind of due date that you changed it. But I was wondering if there's any passages that just didn't quite land, that you still are nagging you, or any that when you read it that you
I always think that Rhododactylos Eos could still use some improvement, Rosy Fingered Dawn, because, I'm fine with what I did, which is then morning born dawn touched the sky with her fingertips of rose. But I originally had and kept until fairly late something like, then dawn, the daughter of morning, streaked the sky with pink fingers. Because, of course, what Homer's thinking of is that early light where the gray sky starts to be streaked, actually, with this suffusion of rosy red. But it's a metaphor. It's not a simile. Right. You don't want to say her fingertips were like red roses. You have to think of a way. And I kept toying with things. I was never totally happy. And I may want to revisit that before we go into paperback. I think the first time anybody ever heard that phrase, rose fingered dawn, they just must have completely been gobsmacked. It's an incredibly vivid image. And I would like to find something that was not quite so tame, something that sort of made your eyes pop open, maybe something with blooming, or I don't know. I like the idea of streaking the sky with her fingers, but I don't like pink. I don't like the word pink.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like a Homeric word. So I'm still thinking about that. But that's the one thing that I always thought there's going to be a solution, and maybe something like the roundabout thing will happen to me, it'll pop into my head, hopefully before the end of this year when we have to close out the paperback edition.
Yeah, speaking of epithets, I think the bright owl-eyed Athena, that's like my new favorite. I think it'll get into the pantheon of rosy-fingered dawn.
I hope so.
I was like, finally, this is a gray-eyed Athena. It's just, it's not it. And like, I love when you talked about the etymology of the word, and it's so perfect. And I think it captures what is so unique about Athena. And it just, you learn more about Athena by having this epithet. So
yeah,
I like, kudos to you, because that was just
Thank you.
amazing.
I'm so happy to hear that. Yeah, I think there's something uncanny about Athena. And as I think I mentioned, I live in the country, and sometimes you go into a barn and there's an owl, and it's very unnerving when that head turns towards you and those luminous, reflective eyes stare at you. And I think that's how the Greeks imagined Athena. You look at those early vase paintings and the eyes are disproportionately huge. I think there's something, you don't want to be the object of that stare unless she's on your side.
Yeah,
so I'm glad you like that.
I think the way that you use epithets and reading it aloud, you get to learn so much about the character, even though it's the same thing, like the sensible lad. Like, you remember that even when he's not maybe acting those sensibly, he's supposed to be. Yeah, eventually.
He needs to grow into his
exactly.
epithet.
Like, I really enjoyed that, and I'm glad that you kept the epithets, because again, it's one of my favorite parts about reading Homer. And maybe because also when you're reading it like in grad school and you're trying to race through as much as you can, you're like, oh, I remember this part. I can get through it.
Right? Believe me, when you're translating, that also happens. You're like, wait, I've done these 30 lines. I can go have lunch early. So.
We're getting near the end of our time. And I want to ask, a lot of our students are going to be listening to the podcast. And we have some really amazing classic students here.
Yeah, I know. I met some of them. I was blown away.
And we have a lot that are beginning their journey to Greek and Latin. We had a lot stop by the Homerathon going, you can learn ancient Greek. And I was like, in fact, you can. Right here. I'll teach it to you.
Right.
And I was wondering if you had any advice for our classic students about starting out with the language, but also sometimes it's hard, right? You're learning your me verbs and you're just like dragging down. And I was wondering if you had some advice to give inspiration for our students.
Greek and Latin are difficult languages with many more complexities than we have in English syntactically and grammatically. And I always say, don't go into learning a language as an exercise in figuring out what the words mean in English. When you learn a new language, you are learning how these people thought. The language is the key to how they thought. The structure of the language is the key to how they thought. And that's much more exciting. It's like a key to a door. And you think, oh, the fact that there is a middle voice in Greek that is somewhere between active and passive is really interesting. It tells you a lot about these people. The fact that Greek has indefinite and definite articles and Latin doesn't. Right. That's super interesting. That tells you something about the Romans, I think. But that if you think of it as a sort of portal to understanding how a civilization understands itself, rather than just what does this verb mean, and I have to remember the principal parts, I think it will be more fun. And there are all those things that we know about, that themis, right, a sort of established idea of what is just in a cosmic sense, is related to the verb tithemi, right? To place, to put something down. That's interesting, right? It's telling you something about the connections these people are making for themselves. And that opens up not just, oh, now I can read 10 lines of Euripides, or now I can read Plato's Apology, but now I understand how these people thought. Yeah. Which is a much larger thing. I think that is more exciting. And it's a carrot that you should always keep dangling in front of yourself, because it isn't easy, to learn these languages. But the payoff is huge, because as I said in my remarks, this is a language in which you can express to the soldiers who are about to be killed in one word.
Right.
That's pretty cool, right? So there's a lot of riches there. Just keep your eye on the prize and remember what the prize is, which is not, oh, now I know how me verbs are conjugated.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
This has been really great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, awesome.
You have been listening to the Virtual Jewel Box podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. Our theme music is Jelly Roll Morton's Perfect Rag. Thanks for joining us.